Good evening, everyone, and welcome to my 5-minute recap of my literature review, which was focusing on rural or remote science literacy. Just to clarify the topic before we start, the literature review did focus on secondary science teachers who are teaching in a rural or remote setting in Australia, who are seeing a decrease in student performance and enrolment in senior science. This is due to multiple factors, but we will be focusing on the lower levels of student literacy in rural or remote schools and the lack of literacy support for those teachers who are teaching science. Now, just to define rural or remote as opposed to urban or metropolitan, using Education Queensland's definition, which classifies a school as rural or remote if it is located 90 kilometres or more from an urban location of 20,000 people or more. And according to late 2007, that made 30% of Queensland state schools rural or remote. The main points that came across in the literature review were that rural and remote students were anywhere from 6 months to 2.5 years behind their urban classmates in overall learning, meaning their literacy would have been as well. There's a high teacher turnover in rural and remote areas, due to a number of factors, but mostly that Australia has a population which lives on its coastline, not in rural or remote areas. These teachers who are going out to these areas, a large percentage of them are graduate teachers, so they do their 1 to 3 years and then they go back to where they're from, wherever that may be. Teachers often are teaching outside of their teaching area due to teacher shortages, so teachers are trying to take up that slack in areas which are not well supported in rural areas, being STEM areas. So science, technology, and maths. And a large percentage of the students that are being taught in these rural remote schools are Indigenous, anywhere up to 90%. A little bit of a positive, an increase in scientific literacy leads to an increase in science learning and engagement, which was a really nice thing to find. And a decrease in scientific literature is a problem across Australia and generally and overseas, and it's always worse in rural areas. I did pop in the fact from MERGA, which is a course reading, about struggling literacy learners being reported as high as 1 in 5, and that was overall across Australia, so it's possible that that percentage is actually larger in rural or remote areas. And when students cannot use their literacy skills, they cannot engage with new scientific content. So it's really strongly backed up by the literature, and they just do not access science as a subject. If they can't speak the language, they just don't get into it. Now, relating this to the curriculum and other policies, of course, all teachers and ACARA have the Alice Springs Education Declaration, equity for all students in mind at all times. The government has also just released in 2018, which is recently, National School Reform Agreement, which has highlighted STEM and rural and remote locations as a priority, which is really positive. Echoed in this essay was the need for quality STEM instruction. We already found that in the literature review, and increased literature instruction for Indigenous students and an equitable access for them to quality secondary education within their rural or remote communities, which means they need teachers who can teach STEM. ACARA also provides some great documents if you want to look on their website for the National Literacy Learning Progression, which is just really great for general literacy, and then if you want to get into the science, the Literature Learning Progression also and science really supports creation of literature around that science. Now, the diverse students that were focused on in this were the Indigenous students. It was a follow-on, and of course Indigenous students are English as a second language learners. And a key point from looking around these students was that some schools didn't teach science because the literacy levels were too low. Our graduate teachers are less equipped than experienced teachers to teach English as a second language students. Positive was that ACARA actually provides an English as a second language teacher resource with annotated content descriptors for science from foundation to year 10. So that's really great. We can use that to create content when you're a graduate teacher and use the supports which are there. Having a quick look in to what is actually available on the ACARA website, there is a framework for Aboriginal languages and Torres Strait Islander languages which assists schools in creating Indigenous language programs, and the schools who have implemented that by meaningfully engaging their Indigenous community have seen an increase in literacy and engagement across all subjects. So a really positive thing for science. In conclusion, rural and remote areas need trained science teachers to increase scientific literacy. They need to know the content area before they can focus on increasing that scientific literacy across a broad range of students in a meaningful way. ACARA has provided resources to assist teachers to increase their scientific literacy abilities, but maybe there needs to be more support in how to use that by more experienced teachers to graduate teachers in rural areas. And just in closing, diverse students deserve the support in rural or remote areas that are available to their urban classmates. This is a human rights issue here and overseas. They shouldn't have to leave their community to get a quality education. Thank you. I hope you found this interesting.